This is the Wisdom Podcast.
Welcome to the Wisdom Podcast. My name is Daniel Aitken, and this week we have Sharon Salzberg joining us. Sharon Salzberg is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular teacher of Buddhist meditation, and co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society. Sharon tells us a little bit about how she came to the Buddhist path. She tells us about her teachers, her meditation practice, and discusses some interesting topics, such as the role of faith and doubt on the path. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Sharon. I read that you encountered Buddhism at college, and so I was actually wondering what the course was, if you remember, and why you might have enrolled in that course.
I did encounter Buddhism at college. I took an Asian philosophy course when I was a sophomore, and honestly, as far as I can remember looking back, it was kind of happenstance. There was a philosophy requirement, so I had to take a philosophy course. And I looked at my schedule and I thought, oh, that fits, it's Tuesday, good. And so I took it. And so, of course, the course completely changed my life. It was there I first heard about Buddhism. I heard, first of all, the Buddha's very open declaration that suffering was a part of life. And I'd had, like many people do, a very difficult childhood. And like for many people, mine was a family system where this was never, ever really spoken about. And so I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings within me. And I felt very isolated and really kind of aberrant. And here was the Buddha saying, happens. This is a part of life. It's not just you. It's not just anyone. It's really a part of things. And so that was the first thing. And I also heard in that course the idea of meditation, that there were tools that existed somewhere that one could use to actually be a happier person. And the university had an independent study program where if you applied and they liked your project, they would send you somewhere like for a year. You could go anywhere you wanted for a year. And with the theory that you'd come back and do your final year. And so I created a project. I said, I want to go to India and study meditation. And they approved it. So off I went. And I stayed longer than a year, as many people did. I did end up going back to school and did what I needed to do. I ended up with 2 years of independent study credit instead of just one. And, met all my different teachers, my earliest teachers, and began my practice.
So that course did have a life-changing effect on you, and recognition of suffering. But then also it seemed to have offered you some tools like meditation for the hope to achieve some type of happiness, whatever that might have meant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it offered me the invitation. I was going to school in Buffalo, New York, and I looked around Buffalo at that time. This was quite some time ago, and I just didn't see it. I didn't see it anywhere. Now I just recently got an invitation from that university for like some giant mindfulness conference. I thought, look at that, things have changed, but it took a while.
And I heard that, so you set off for India, and I read somewhere that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche gave you some advice as you were leaving. What did he say?
Yeah, so this is maybe 3 or 4 days before. I was going with a small group of friends to India, and I knew I was really interested in Buddhist meditation. I didn't know really where to go to find it. And then I heard that Trungpa Rinpoche, who was like a genuine Tibetan Lama, was coming to Buffalo, New York. He wasn't coming to my university. He was going to a different college. And so I went to his lecture, and they asked for written questions. And I wrote down the question, something like, I'm leaving for India in 3 days to study Buddhist meditation. Do you have a suggestion where I should go? And so this big pile of questions in front of him, and he reached in and he pulled out my question, and he read it out loud, and he was silent for a moment, and then he said, I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accident. And that was it. That was his blessing. It was like no addresses, no handy monastery guidebook, I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accent. That's exactly how it happened.
So you just arrived in India and
Yeah, I mean, we went overland, as many people did, so just arrived as, a little more casual than it was, it was train and bus and, overland through all those countries. And then upon arrival in India, we went to Dharamsala because I knew the Dalai Lama lived there and I heard he was a Buddhist, and that was one of those situations where, even though there were very great lamas there, of course, but I had such a yearning for like very practical, direct methods, tools that I could actually use. And it was just one of those situations where things didn't quite work. There was a great lama and he had a class, and I'd show up for the class and they'd say, well, the translator's left town for 2 weeks, so we'd wait 2 weeks and then, it just didn't happen. And it was while I was in Dharamsala that I overheard in a Tibetan restaurant, somebody was having a conversation about an international yoga conference that was going to happen in New Delhi. And I thought, I'll find a teacher there. So we went to New Delhi, and it was a very kind of dispiriting affair, the low point of which was these yogis and swamis up on the stage, like pushing and shoving against each other to be the first to grab the mic and speak. So I thought it'll never happen. But Dan Goldman at that time was a graduate student in psychology, and I don't even know how it happened. For some reason, he was delivering a paper. He was giving a talk at that conference. And at the end of the talk, he mentioned that he was on his way to this town called Bodh Gaya to do an intensive 10-day meditation retreat that was very free of cultural baggage and very direct transmission of tools. And I thought, that's it. And it was it. So in effect, he took me to my first meditation retreat.
And so you went from New Delhi to Bodh Gaya there, and you'd seen this circus, or I want it, the stripped down version, thank you. And so what did you find in Bodh Gaya?
Well, I arrived in Bodh Gaya December of 1970, and S.N. Goenka had left Burma not long before. He was ethnically, he was Indian. His family had grown up in Burma. He'd grown up in Burma, and his mother was in India, and she was ill. So visas were extremely complicated in those days, but he got a visa to return to India and be with his mother, and then she recovered, and he began teaching these 10-day meditation retreats. So this was maybe the third or fourth one he'd ever taught. And so that started January 7th, 1971. And so I just had my 45th anniversary of becoming a meditator. And it wasn't a totally silent retreat, but it was, they locked the gate. And there we were. Many of my closest friends were people I met there. Joseph Goldstein and, Krishnadas and Ramdas, and so many people were at my first retreat. And it was amazing. It was just amazing because I look back at it sometimes, just that sense of discovery, like, wow, my breath did this, a little wiggle before anything, really. But it was so exciting. And it was difficult. It was, there were no chairs, there were no zafus. Physically, it was excruciating. And Goenka was fabulous, and it was very, he would chant at night and in the morning, and it would just be this sense of really a journey, this tremendous journey. And
so you did your first retreat, and so you had this, what made you come back for? Did you do another one straight away?
Yeah, I think clearly it was just the beginning, and because Goenka stayed and he kept teaching retreat after retreat with some short gaps, sometimes between retreats, but he was there for some period of time, and it's Bodh Gaya, which is the town where the descendant of the tree, it is said, the Buddha was sitting under when he became enlightened is, and so. It was this amazing, amazing place, and the tree, and, and in those days it was very easy to, spend all night sitting under the tree, sadly without the same results as the Buddha, but it wasn't that hard to do. You just had to get permission.
So you were outside and the retreat was outside and under the...
No, the retreat was in the Burmese temple, Burmese Vihara, but... in those in-between days or whatever, or if you stayed on and Goenka had gone.
It's quite an amazing journey, right? You were in college, you just first heard about the Buddha and meditation, and then fast forward, not too far forward, and you're under the Bodhi tree meditating. Wow. That must have been like that. Were you a parent that, was it like, did that sort of occur to you that, wow, I'm really diving into this? And
I felt totally correct, totally right. I mean, I've never looked back from there. It was 1971, so the beginning of 1971.
And what was the practice?
It was 3 days of mindfulness of the breath at the nostrils, and then he taught a body scan, which he called sweeping. Mm-hmm. Where you move your attention through your body, starting with the top of your head, feeling the different sensations or lack of sensations, whatever you encountered. And Goenka's favorite thing to say was, be equanimous, be equanimous, be equanimous. And we used to whisper to each other, is that a word? Like, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. And, but the idea is that you developed equanimity and a balanced awareness regardless of what you uncovered.
Okay.
Whether it was pleasant, painful, or neutral.
So this idea of equanimity, it's probably something that has informed your practice since then, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like even today, going around, we're here at IMS and you're teaching a retreat. This idea of equanimity, has it developed, or are you teaching just like Goenka Ji? What does equanimity mean to you?
Well, I'm not teaching just like Goenka because the method is also different. But actually, I would say the first thought that comes to my mind, if you're talking about his influence on me, is actually something he said the first night of that retreat, which was that the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. So it was completely open and inclusive. And sometimes when I hear people talk about secular mindfulness with a kind of disparaging, tone, I think, well, it's always been secular for me because he was my first teacher and that was my first night, and so that was the foundation. This is not about a belief system. This is not about joining something or, getting a new identity as a Buddhist or rejecting anything else. This is about a way of life. And so that was, one of the most profound. Plus, he opened the door for me of practice. So that was incomparable. It was really great. But I am teaching this retreat as a loving kindness retreat, and one of the 4 qualities that are usually talked about together are, it's loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So,
and you've also written a lot about faith, and so faith is a little bit of a loaded word in our culture. Sometimes faith and secularism are put up against each other, but of course, you write a lot about faith that is how they can coexist. So, do you mind telling us a little bit about your ideas on faith?
Yeah, I wrote one book called Faith, and it was really about my faith journey and kind of the Buddhist framework of faith as I understood it, certainly within the Theravadan tradition or Burmese tradition. And from that point of view, faith isn't like a thing or a commodity you either have or you don't have. And if you don't have enough or you don't have the right kind, you're going to be condemned. It's not like that. It's a journey and it's an evolution, and things that for us are somewhat surprising are considered important parts of that evolution. So the first stage of faith or first phase of faith they talk about is called bright faith, and that's likened to falling in love. It's like this amazing state of like, wow, something's possible where I thought nothing was possible before. And the examples used of being in like a tight, enclosed room, the door's shut, and then somehow the door swings open. And you don't quite know what's out there, but you think, wow, there is something out there. It's so much bigger than I had imagined. And it's a very intoxicating state. And it's glorious, it's fabulous. And but it's also kind of vulnerable, and that's why it's considered just the first stage of faith. So you might be fickle in that phase. You might kind of fall. You might. I mean, it depends on what swings the door open. It could be art, it could be inspiration, it could be a lot of things. But let's say it's a teacher. Then you think, wow, I'm going to follow this teacher and this approach. And then the next day you meet another one. And you think, wow, forget that other guy. I'm following this one. Because that sense of that beautiful feeling is not really grounded in our own experience. It seems to rely on proximity, to some external person or scene or something. And it's especially dangerous because when we feel that sense of dependency, and it's such an incredible feeling, we don't want to lose it. And so that becomes the place where people become very timid about, say, asking questions or pointing out things that might make them uneasy, which is not a good...
What's an example of that, like pointing out? Is that like coming to terms with some difficulty? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, something like, you may feel... your teacher actually doesn't understand something, and you wonder why they approached somebody the way they did. And it's not to say you're always correct, but if you have the feeling you dare not even ask, then that's a troubling sign. So the freedom to ask is really very important. Otherwise, what is called bright faith can degenerate into blind faith, as we use the term. And it's said that the next phase of faith is called verified faith. And the way you get from bright faith to verified faith, ironically, is by doubt. It's by questioning and wondering and putting something into practice and finding out for yourself what's true. And so it has to be the right kind of doubt, not like cynical doubt or, dismissive doubt, but really questioning. So this points back to the Buddha himself saying, put it into practice. See for yourself what's true. So it's your own practice that's going to speak to you, that's going to reinforce your faith.
So that's an amazing point, because normally we think, or I think of faith in terms of, suppress doubt to have faith.
That's right.
But here we've got to cultivate a certain doubt to grow faith.
Definitely, it is unusual and amazing, and it does need to be the right kind of doubt. It has to be like we really want to know, we want to understand, and we also believe we're capable of understanding.
There's a sense of freedom that goes along with that.
It's so different, from how. I mean, when I was working on the book, and people would say, like, "Why are you writing a book on that?" But they were. They were suffering from their own childhood experience of faith, or being silenced, or told not to ask questions, or questions would get them into trouble, and it's very different.
Can you think back in your life and find times where there were doubts, big doubts, and how you coped with them, and what tools, Buddhist tools you used, or any tools you used to deal with doubt?
I wouldn't say like huge doubt, but certainly doubt. Early on in my practice, because I'd met a number of teachers. I was living in India, so of different lineages and really different traditions. I was full of doubt about what to do, which to pursue, and so when I sit to meditate, rather than actually meditating, I would think, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do that? Which one's better? Which one's faster? How will I get enlightened faster? Well, those people seem more enlightened than these people, but then I know these people better than I know those people. If I knew everyone the same, maybe they wouldn't seem so enlightened. Should I do this? Should I do that? So it was like a complete waste of time. And I wasn't practicing at all. And finally I said to myself, just do something. You're not going to resolve it in your head. You have to put something into practice. And so I did. So that's a kind of doubt, that just keeps us stuck.
A doubt of not knowing what to do, what's best to do, that keeps you in some sort of paralysis.
Yeah, and, we're so stuck in that state.
And the solution is just to do something.
I think so. I mean, I would say now this, for me, or one way of phrasing it is, the solution is structure. Like you're not going to make a lifetime commitment. That makes no sense. Do something for a month. Do something every day for a month, and then look at it. Right, you've got to kind of get out of that stuckness.
And then bring that other doubt into it. Was this helpful? I've done this for a month.
No, questioning and doubt are different.
Okay, so tell me about that.
Well, in the sense that questioning is good. You have to question. I mean, you're not going to do something forever.
Yeah, but that's the type of questioning doubt that flourishes the faith you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So what about, so you're in India and you're doing these practices and things are coming up like doubt. What about inspiration? What are some of the things, that really sparked you during that time?
Actually, Bodh Gaya itself was extremely inspiring. Goldstein once said about the stupa that's behind the tree. He said, it is so beautiful and it's so extraordinary a spot. And he said, it's commensurate with what happened there, It's that incredible thing. And so being there was inspiring. India was inspiring. And my teachers were enormous inspirations. I had several teachers who were extremely important for me. And one of whom, this woman Dipa Ma, is the reason that I began to teach.
I heard Dipa Ma, she sort of predicted about what you might be doing or something.
Yeah. So I went to India, came back somewhere in 72 or something to finish school, and then went back to India. And in 74, I was coming back to the U.S. for what I was sure was going to be a very short visit. And I went to Calcutta to see her and say goodbye for my short visit back to the U.S. before I went back to India to spend the entire rest of my life there. And Joseph had already come back. He was maybe 6 months before he'd come back. And so I went to see her, and she said, when you go back to the U.S., you'll be teaching with Joseph. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. And then she said two things that were amazing. One, she said, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach. Which, first of all, coming from her, who had had such huge suffering in her life and had somehow metabolized it all into compassion. And also because now I joke and I say, well, she didn't say like your realization is so awesome or your, your scholarship is so amazing or anything. She said, you really understand suffering, you should teach. And which was a whole new way of looking at the difficulties I'd had in my life. And then she said, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it that's going to stop you. And I left her, we'd call it like a tenement room. Went down the stairs thinking, no, I won't. I'm not going to do that. And I came back to the U.S. and Joseph at this point was in Boulder, Colorado. Trungpa Rinpoche had just opened up Naropa Institute. It was the first summer, and Joseph was teaching. And our joke was that amongst this group of people who'd met and become friends in India, and we're now back in the U.S., he was the only one with a job and an apartment. So we went to Boulder. We had nowhere to go. And he had a one-bedroom apartment in this student complex that Naropa had given him. And at one point, 9 of us moved into his apartment. And Joseph, is very meticulous. He couldn't stand it. And he tells the story. He said it was really awful until he let go of the thought that it was his apartment. And then he was fine. We were just living together, so that was great. So he was invited to stay on for the second summer session, and I stayed on with him, and we began teaching together. And then we got an invitation for a month-long retreat, which was the first retreat we taught in this country. And then we had met Jack Cornfield in Boulder, and so we just started responding to invitations, 2 of us or 3 of us. And at one point, we were living in California. Somebody came through and said to us, why don't you actually start a proper retreat center? It would be like a sacred site in this country. It would be a repository for all the kind of amazing energy that gets engendered when people come together to practice. And I know that this guy said, I know just the people who can help you. They're all on the East Coast. So much to the sorrow of many, we came back to the East Coast. People say, you could have had anywhere. There was nothing here. But they weren't all in Massachusetts, and they were enormous help. And we looked up and down the East Coast and finally found what is now where we're sitting, the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. And one day I woke up and I thought about what Dipa Ma had said, and I thought, oh, she was right.
And what a teaching as well. You understand suffering.
Yeah.
In terms of like what makes a good teacher, in terms of what you need to understand. And so then with that instruction, you come to America, and so it's one thing to go to India and learn and study and do retreats. It's another whole kettle of fish to come to a new country where meditation, that word is hardly even known. And if it is known, there's certain preconceptions around what it is. How do you even start teaching meditation here? What was going through your mind when you were invited and you were like, and knowing that the people who go to India have a certain sort of passion around it. And so they're willing to they'll do silent retreats. And yes, I'm just wondering how it all unfolded.
Well, we were very young. I was 23 when we started this place. So younger when I started teaching. And we didn't really have any models for what we were doing in the sense of the retreat center. Yeah. We modeled a lot of really everything we were doing on our own Asian teachers. It wasn't like a weird adaptation. Like the form pretty much came from Goenka of an intensive retreat. Yeah. Discourse at night, practice during the day. The methods were, right from those teachers. The only teaching we did was in the forms of intensive retreat, which is interesting. Oh, wow. We weren't teaching classes or workshops
And that was just, was that a conscious decision or that just how it unfolded?
I think it was probably an unconscious decision, and then that was the form we were most used to. And, it took a long time to realize where we were in the sense of like a 10-day course is different than a 9-day course if you work a 5-day week. Yes. Whereas a 9-day course, you just take get 2 weekends and just 1 week off of work. Yeah. Where if you've got that weird 10th day, where does it come from? So it's like, oh, why are we teaching 10-day courses? We should be teaching 9-day courses. Okay. Look at that. And I think in those days, you hit a very, very interesting point, which I actually talk about a lot, which is, the consuming interest we each had in order to end up in Asia. I went to India when I was 18 years old. I'd never even been to California when I went to India because I was suffering mightily, and I sensed a way to help that or heal that. And it's very different than when it's very casual.
What were the students looking for back then? And today, the people that come to the retreat you're running now, has it changed, or is it still the same thing people are yearning for?
On one level, I'm sure it must be the same thing. But I would say that, there have been waves, like the earliest people were people who maybe had been to India themselves, or I remember people who wished they'd gone when they were younger. It had been like a life's dream, but they ended up, raising a family or having a career or something. So now is their chance to explore the things they wish to explore. Then and certainly psychotherapists were very interested, like students of the mind, and there was a wave of retired people. People having like a new lease on life, looking for a new level of meaning. And then there were waves of younger people, and then there were, waves of artists, and then the scientists. It's like it's been a lot of fun.
That's been like over, quite a long time, right? These different waves, or were they happening? Are these happening over decades, or is this?
Yeah, it's over quite a long time. Yeah. Wow. I remember once a friend whose wife is an artist said to me, we were in class in New York together, and I was teaching. He said, look at how many artists are here. He said, you really know that a teaching or a point of view has gotten firm roots in a new place when the artists get into it. And maybe 2 years later, I was somewhere else in the country, and I was having lunch with a scientist friend of mine, and he said, "Look how many scientists are getting involved. You really know it's planting firmly in a new place when the scientists get it." It was very funny.
You're involved with Mind and Life, right?
Yeah,
So,
a little bit, yeah.
How did you get involved in that?
I think I was first involved in that when they invited me to a conference with the Dalai Lama. It was 1989 or 1990. I think it was 89. And it was a conference about emotion, which was very interesting. And it was a small conference in Dharamsala. And first of all, there's no word in Tibetan, as I understand it, for emotion, so... so that's interesting. And it was there that I got my chance to plant my flag in Buddhist history by asking the Dalai Lama, what do you think of self-hatred? And he didn't know what I was talking about.
Because that was a foreign concept?
It seemed a very mystifying concept to him. And, that's not to deify Tibetan or Asian culture, which I wouldn't want to do. But I think that sort of rock bottom sense of what a human being is capable of and what we will discover within ourselves if we look deeply enough. It's not so desolate, So he didn't understand what we were talking about. And he said, "Is that some kind of nervous disorder?"
Nervous disorder, wow.
It was so fun. And and all these people were jumping up and down and saying all these things. And then he started saying, "But you have Buddha nature. How could you think of yourself that way?" And it was very interesting.
It's very interesting because I guess Buddhist circles we're often talking about how, our sense of self and we're always protecting ourself and there's desire and aversion always comes from this sense of self. Mm-hmm. So the idea that could also lead to self-hatred as well, or whatever we call it, is an interesting way of it bending back on itself. Mm-hmm. Have you found it fruitful, the discussion with scientists?
Yeah, I think... they're, first of all, it's the language of our time. And I think that, it's been powerful to see, it's almost like a new professional category of contemplative neuroscience, something like that. You think, wow. That same investigative, find out for yourself, put it into practice. Yeah. That same mode is very much the mode of science.
And what do you see their focus on? So this conference you were talking about before was on emotions. Is there a specific thing that the scientists are looking into, or is it varied?
I think it's quite varied. There's any number of even for Mind and Life, their mission has really broadened, and so where they're, helping fund original research and things like that. And, I've seen that when John Kabat-Zinn sort of devised mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's sort of a perfect vehicle for research. And I think it has, of all the modalities, it's been pretty highly researched. And now I see compassion is starting to have its day,
that's true.
There's much more interest brewing as in addition to mindfulness in compassion and loving kindness, which of course makes me happy.
Well, it's wonderful, and there's this word kindfulness we're hearing a lot now. So moving from mindfulness to Ajahn Brahm's kindfulness. So I think that's a good sign, actually. So and you do a lot of, so this is a good segue to metta meditation. Right, so you seem to teach a lot of metta practice. Can you sort of describe to us what that practice is and why someone might want to not just meditate on the breath, but why some people are doing other types of meditation as well?
Well, in my first exposure to meditation, which was the Goenka course, he ends the courses with a very short, almost ceremonial way of saying goodbye, which is metta meditation. So that was the first time I heard of it. And I thought, ooh, what's that? And I was very intrigued by it, but I never had a chance to study it in depth in a structured way with a teacher until 1985 when I went to Burma and did it for 3 months. So we say that the breath is really, the way we use it is a prelude to mindfulness. And the way we use that word is a quality of awareness where our perception of what's happening in the present moment is not so distorted by bias. So, all kinds of old habits arise when we have an emotion or we see a sight or anything happens, and those old reactions might take over very quickly, and then we hardly even know what's going on. So one example would be if you have a very uncomfortable sensation in your body, and right away you start thinking, what's it going to feel like in 10 minutes? What's it going to feel like in 20 minutes? What's it going to feel like in a month? So you're adding all of that anticipation on top of what's already a difficult situation, and it's that much harder to be with. And so those things will come up, but mindfulness gives us the ability to see them quickly, to relinquish their hold, and be more with our genuine experience as it is. And which is why it's considered the gateway to wisdom, because we can see things more accurately, more clearly. And loving kindness is a whole other approach. It's a whole other method, which has, I call it a stretch. It's like if you realize you have certain ruts of attention, you have certain habitual ways of paying attention, we recognize that and we kind of play. So one example would be if you're in the habit at the end of the day of looking back at yourself from that day, almost as though to evaluate yourself, and maybe you have the habit, which most of us do, of pretty well only thinking about the mistakes you've made or what you did wrong or what you could have done better. And so the stretch is almost like saying, anything good happened today? Like any good within me? And some people don't like that kind of practice, or they feel uncertain about it because they're afraid they're moving from a true place, which is looking at all their problems, to a phony place. But it's not a phony place. It's just a place that gets very little airtime from us. So it's moving from a true place to another true place. And what we come to in the end is actually a more complete picture of who we are, rather than just the being who messed up all day. So it's got a different sort of feeling tone, the practice, a different texture. People do it partly, even they say the Buddha taught it as the antidote to fear. If you feel you've got something like that going on and you want to get into a more balanced place, you practice it. These days it's more available than it used to be, so you might just practice it because you're intrigued. You want to see what it's like. And I think for many people, it is like the missing ingredient. It's like, it's one thing to say, be mindful. It's another thing to actually not be judging yourself, with what you're seeing.
I read a story. I don't know, something about you were on retreat and you dropped a jar.
That was right across the hall. I should take you there as a little site visit. So, like I said, I had always wanted to do intensive loving kindness practice, but it sort of wasn't happening. And then so I started my practice in January of 1971. We moved in here and opened the retreat center in February of 1976. So we didn't have any programming for the first month. So those of us who were here decided, okay, well, we'll just sit for a month. So I thought, okay, I've got a month. I don't have a teacher, but I know how you do intensive loving kindness practice, so I'll do it. And I know you started with offering loving kindness to yourself, and you move through these various categories of beings, like loved ones and strangers, and till you come to all beings everywhere. So I spent the first week, it was right across the hall, just doing loving kindness for myself. And I felt absolutely nothing. It was like a completely dreary week. And then something happened to like a friend of ours in Boston. So several of us had to suddenly leave the retreat. And I was in the bathroom across the hall getting ready to go when I dropped this big jar of something, and the jar just like went down on the tile floor and shattered, and the stuff went everywhere. And I can remember the very first thought that came up in my mind was, you are really a klutz, but I love you. And I thought, look at that. You could have given me anything in the course of the week, and I could not have honestly said something was happening, but something was happening.
So there's something going on at some level, right? And so that is like an outcome of your metta practice?
Yeah. I learned a big lesson from that, which is first of all, you can't evaluate while you're doing it, because then you're not doing it, you're just evaluating it.
Yeah.
And second, I think we do need to evaluate and assess, but the thing to look at is not your formal meditation experience. The thing to look at is your life. Like, how do you speak to yourself when you've made a mistake? How do you meet a stranger? How are you in adverse circumstance? Things like that.
And then, so there seems like to be two dimensions operating in a way. So like when something happens, like you smash something, and there's this like self-talk that comes up, but there's also this emotion, right? And so like I might think like this. Maybe I'll give you an example. Like, oops, I just interrupted Sharon Salzberg. Yeah, what? And the self-talk might be, oh, what an idiot. But there's an emotion with that as well. So there's one thing to be aware of those two things. Then what do we do with that? So it seems like you can sort of be aware of self-talk and you can sort of like intervene in a way. But what about emotions which seem forced upon you? How does meditation help that practice?
Well, I mean, we say that mindfulness helps us see the difference between the actual experience and the story we're starting to weave about it. It's one thing to feel that rush of embarrassment or whatever, but then we grab onto it and we take it to heart and we build a whole story and a whole self-image. And I'm never gonna, amount to anything because I'm just the kind of person who interrupts people all the time, and like I'm gonna be alone the rest of my life and like hopeless, and that's what we do, right? Yeah. So mindfulness allows us to see like the beginning of that story. I'm worthless, I never do anything right, and let it go. And they say metta changes our default story. So if the kind of most hypercritical, mean-spirited story is the one that usually comes in, and you do enough metta, it won't always be the story. It'll be like, whoops. We'll make mistakes.
So is metta what you're most interested in teaching?
I'd say metta for sure is something that, and and then apart from certain methods, it's teaching different kinds of people. So it's more the population than the style. So, I've spent time like through this place, the Garrison Institute, working with domestic violence shelter workers, with international humanitarian aid workers, or just on my own, with first responders or people, and it's like, it's very gratifying work. And people like that already have, I find, obviously a huge amount of empathy and compassion. It's just they're burning out, so something else is going on. Yeah. At the same time.
And you do work with the Holistic Life Foundation, is that?
Yeah, I love those guys. Yeah.
It's more about who you're engaging with and how you're helping different groups of people. That's nice. So, Castro, did you have questions?
I guess I'm thinking of two questions. One is, because we have such a big Tibetan Buddhist audience, actually, at Wisdom, and listening to the podcast. So, any stories or memories you have of any of those Rinpoches that kind of stand out to you?
I mean, there's so many, Chogyam Rinpoche was my first Tibetan teacher in India, and somebody just yesterday at the opening of this retreat gave me a phenomenal looking book about the 16th Karmapa.
Oh yeah, that new book.
It's amazing. Fantastic. So I met him, and it was a time like that time in India was hard to describe, even in that it's like. I check into a hotel in Calcutta. I find out Chogyam Rinpoche, who's one of the greatest living lamas, was in the same hotel, giving teachings in the dining room or something. It was all like that. So they were all there and available. And later on I studied some with Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, with Nyosho Ken Rinpoche, and now one of Tulku Urgyen's sons, Soni Rinpoche. Mm-hmm. So. It's like a big part of my life, I
guess, and related to that, so obviously that's a different traditions from what you ended up being in. Yeah. And obviously there's differences and similarities, but is there any, I guess when you practiced with them, was there any practice or any teaching that kind of like influenced you deeply or that you carry with you?
Well, I think some of it was just the personal feeling, like when I think of Nyosho Ken Rinpoche, like I met him in Paris the first time, and he was being swarmed by like 7-year-old school children, and and I just loved him. And some of it was around, I think what had happened was really in my own practice. I'd had certain experiences that I really didn't know how to describe, and I didn't have the language for. And if I was gonna, use language, it would be Zen, or it would be Tibetan, Mahamudra or Dzogchen language, and this, this is like, remember, I'm really older. And so, like when I was in India, there were no computers. There was no internet. You just research people on.
I remember that.
There were no cell phones. There were very few books in English. So if you heard an inspiring passage somewhere or you read it, you'd write it down in your own notebook. So, if I still have my notebook. If I look back at it, I think, wow, look what I was writing down. Because, so once I met teachers who actually were from those lineages, teaching Dzogchen, I thought, oh yeah, that's why.
My other question was kind of what your own practice looks like.
When I do sit each day, the formal sitting is really pretty well mindfulness or an awareness practice of some kind. And I also have a resolve. I don't do that much formal loving kindness anymore. I did only loving kindness practice for about 4 years, from around that time I went to Burma in 85. But these days when I sit, even though I always tell myself, oh, you should do more of that, and maybe I will. Mostly it's not that. It's more like an open awareness practice, but I have this resolve to do loving kindness whenever I'm waiting, and I count every mode of transportation as waiting. So airplanes and taxis and subways. And,
so it's like a contextual practice. I like that.
And literally waiting in someone's waiting room or whatever, So it figures mostly in that way. And when I think about what comes up, it's mostly the thought of I should do more practice. I should go on retreat more.
So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Sharon. Next episode we have Alan Wallace joining us, and we have a wide-ranging conversation about the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, from shamatha to Dzogchen.
Which I didn't understand. I just felt, this is it. And it was 20 years before circumstances came together for me to really have an opportunity to immerse myself in the study and practice of Dzogchen. And that was 1990 with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Until then, it was all Gelugpa, Theravada, Sakya. But on a more cognitive level, I found here a tradition that was not simply religion, it's not simply science, not simply philosophy. It includes all three elements. But what really caught me, and then it's held me ever since, is here is a path of ever-deepening meaning, but also ever-deepening insight, understanding, knowledge, and they're all bound into one. Wisdom and skillful means, you could say. And that's been enormously good.